Happy Friday, guys, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Dubs. I'm your host, Bill T. Well, 7 weeks to go until one crazy weekend. Book your rooms today. Go to letstalkdubs.com and get your rooms reserved. First block of rooms sold out. We've extended the block. There are more rooms to purchase for your one crazy weekend that you're going to have here in Las Vegas with me and a bunch of other listeners and people that have been years before. Every year it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and this year is no exception. We've got record number of pre-registration. I also wanted to mention that you guys might want to pre-register because we're going to probably cap it at about 100 cars, and we were pretty close to that last year. We'll be parking them a little bit more structured this year, and if you want to come in as a club, you guys need to show up at the same time. That's the only way you'll park together. So make sure you guys have your stuff in place. We'll be reserving spaces inside the car show based on pre-registration. So if you're going, you'll want to pre-register now and make sure that you put in the comment section that you're part of a group, and we will put you guys together. All pre-registration people get priority for parking and have a space reserved. If they show up on Thursday, they'll have a space already reserved, which will kind of be your space for the weekend. So that's filling out. It's awesome. I've got more pre-registers 7 weeks out than we had last year, and it just keeps building. So I'm super excited. If you guys have been before, then you know what it's all about. So again, that's one crazy weekend that's going to be taking place at the Orleans Hotel and Casino. So you guys make sure you get pre-registered today. The best weekend of your life. That's without question. So make sure you guys go get situated, get that handled so you don't say you missed out on the greatest weekend you're going to have in your Volkswagen all year. That's guaranteed. Now, on to other news. Zorba is on its way. Zorba has left the building. As of now, Zorba should be loaded on a ship and on its way here to the States. It's loaded up with its companion. There's another car that's coming over with Zorba, which will be something you guys will see at One Crazy Weekend as well. And I'm pretty excited. Right now, I haven't seen the whole car as an entire car. I haven't seen some of the detail stuff that Andy's done for me. It's kind of a surprise. So I'll see the car first time once Andy's here in the States. It'll be before the show, so I can take it on the cruise, on the strip cruise Friday night, which is pretty exciting. And that's part of the genesis of why I wanted to have this podcast. And so on today's podcast, we're going to discuss the custom car scene in the VW hobby, where it's been, what's happening with it, and the evolution of it. And it's going to be this is kind of an editorial. This is going to be my 2 cents on this. And next week, I'm probably going to have a guest on that maybe he's going to agree or disagree with some of the things that I said. But we're definitely going to take all comers. And if you've got something that you feel like you need to address on this, then odds are you should probably send me a message at bill@letstalkdubs.com. Give me your 2 cents with respect to the issues that I'm going to be bringing up, and or some of my my descriptions of what's happening with the scene. And we're going to kind of go over kind of what's been happening with the VW scene. I'm going to kind of do it starting in the early days of the hobby. But with that, we're going to get into it. What's going on with the custom car scene? Where are we at as Volkswagens? And this is all according to Bill on Let's Talk Dubs.
You probably don't know that there's a new Volkswagen out that doesn't look like a Volkswagen. It's got everything that people who like the bug like.
Well, like I said in the intro, today's episode, we're going to talk about the evolution of the custom car scene in the VW hobby. And I started thinking about this as I was building the Ghia. When I say building the Ghia, obviously we know Andy Finch and his team over there, Jay and Chris and Megan, all those folks over there, plus a team of people executed the build on my car. But my car is my ideas, my colors. There's some collaboration on a lot of stuff between Andy and myself, and we both have similar tastes and styles. And so it was really a collaboration. But what this brought me to think about was, where's the scene at Volkswagen wise? And it seems like there's been a little bit of an evolution in the scene from the early days. And that's what I was going to cover in tonight's podcast. So on today's podcast, we're looking at the evolution of the custom hobby for Volkswagens. And going back to the beginning of the VW magazines, when you're looking at the popularity in the late 60s, early 70s that started with the Volkswagen scene, what you really start to see is the Volkswagen is really popular. And just like any other car that gets super popular, people start to individualize those cars by doing custom modifications. And then it becomes who can make their car more custom than the next guy. And from that starts to evolve into full custom things. And we're talking about how the scene is evolving on a custom platform. And what I mean by that is, based on parts, pieces, and things that are available, what's making the scene change, and how are influences that are outside in the car hobby making things change. Obviously, some of the early things that people did is they did performance upgrades. And from performance upgrades, they would start, customizing their car by making them individuals. We know that the first VW Trends magazine was actually financed pretty much by Autohaus. I mean, you heard the Autohaus podcast. If you haven't, go back and listen to that, and you get the whole history of how that came together. And VW Trends, I mean, the core reason behind that first issue was that there was a 30-page catalog, 36-page catalog in there that was basically all Autohaus. It was their complete catalog in issue number 1 that came out in 1976. And obviously Hot VWs was around before then. But going by, and for reference, I'm at a website called 99wspeedshop.com. They've got tons of back issue magazines. And what's cool is you can see a bunch of them at a glance, and you start to see the evolution of the hobby. Just by, and I did this really based on looking at covers of the magazine, because the covers of the magazine, especially in the beginning of the hobby in the late 60s, early 70s, when you started to see these cars in the magazine, it would be indicative of what's happening in the VW hobby. So with that being said, as you look at these, and really, I want to say the scene really started getting into the more custom stuff around probably mid 70s. In the 60s, late 60s, the fiberglass craze was crazy. There was tons of, fiberglass body mods and things like that. And then people started kind of getting into, as Volkswagen's moved into the used car market, people started getting them, hot rodding them, and customizing them from that way. It was inexpensive cars for young kids to get into. And from that, obviously as young kids get into things, they start to customize and individualize their cars. Now, with that, then you get the car shows, because obviously there's all these people building custom cars or modifying their cars. And because the Volkswagen platform is fairly universal, you start to get these car shows where they've got a bunch of different events, everything from drag racing to autocross and, engine pulls, all these cool, unique things. I think Volkswagen is probably the only car show that had engine pulls that I would think would make sense, that were kind of on a regular basis. But there was a lot of different avenues of customization. And I'm really going to focus primarily on the evolution of the hobby when it starts to gain heavy traction. In the early days of the used car hobby, you had so many different facets of it. And then when I'm speaking more specifically to like the car show scene, it's going to be what you're going to have a tendency to see a lot of out there. And for me, when I got into the VW scene, first magazine I looked at was in 1987. Probably saw a magazine or two before then, but it's the VW Trends magazine from 87. And it was, I'll tell you the issue that it is, but the cover was a striking picture of Cat's Rag, and it was November 1988. But I have a September 88 magazine. I've got some other magazines that were before that I had already acquired, but the one that really kind of stopped me in my tracks was the November 1988 issue. And the reason was because cat's rag that was on there. That car was indicative of everything you saw in the 80s. And in the 80s, where a lot of us got into the VW scene, you'd see a lot of people, because Volkswagens were old enough that they were inexpensive and guys that were just starting to drive could get them and customize them. And guys that had a little less money than mini truck guys would go buy a Beetle and then kind of learn to be a big DIY guy, do it yourself, and, you know, build them yourself. And that would push us to do things like raspberry paint jobs because they became popular, or, you know, M&M green. I mean, there's so many of these wild paint colors that were starting in the 80s. And, you know, you had trends that started in, let's say, the custom car end of things, right? So we're talking about looking at these earlier issues where in January 85, you've got the chopped, it's a chopped convertible. I can't recall the owner's name of the car, but he had it featured both trends and Hot VW same year. And it's from Denver. It just recently sold. So you had, you know, Carson top Volkswagens, and you had guys in the early 80s like Scott Gildner doing scallops on cars, and he's out of the San Fernando Valley. And what's interesting is a lot of the hobby, the customization was really heavy with respect to where they were getting influences from, what was in the area. And well, let's say for Scott Gildner, for example, his background comes from hot rodding. He likes hot rods. A lot of stuff he built had hot rod flair to it. And then it kind of pushed those cars in a different direction. And then you have the Bakersfield crew, right? The first car, March of 84, was the pink convertible Ghia. And that car was one of the first ones from Bakersfield that was on the magazine. And then you have the entire Bakersfield contingent, right? And that Bakersfield contingent, you know, had a lot of the guys that were names to be known back then, which was like Steve Connect, George Delfino, Chris Addington, all these guys that were building custom cars. And so the custom car scene was unique from the standpoint of, but there's always a thread, right? And really the most important thing was that people were expressing their individualism through these cars. But there was different levels of it. When you look at the cars that were coming out of Bakersfield, in the 80s, it was more about trying to make your car more futuristic. So power windows, center consoles, a lot of things that didn't come with your Volkswagens originally, Recaro seats, those types of things. Up, like, it was kind of an 80s update with things that were new and cool in the 80s, which you don't really see right now, right? You don't see people putting custom touches in their car that are from the 2000s a lot. And what I mean by that is when you're going to a car show in the mid 80s and you're looking at cars with Recaro seats or aftermarket seats to make it more comfortable, center consoles, that's a hugely popular thing, not only in the custom car, show car thing, but in actually the street cars that are out there. So a couple of those things were, although they were, and maybe you could say the same thing that I'm thinking about now, back then, right? Everything was kind of within a box, and it was flashy color paints, aftermarket seats, cool chrome or polished wheels, typically going to be something that stays within the lug pattern, again, because of certain limitations. Now, there was always a couple of guys out there that were building custom cars. They were a machinist, or they had access to specialty tools and equipment to where they could really change up the wheels or do something wild. So every now and again, you get something really out of left field like that. But for the most part, in the 80s, a lot of the custom cars that you see had a tendency to be flashy paint, shiny wheels, aftermarket seats, big stereo systems. Stereos were getting hot. A lot of graphics happening back then. A lot of rag tops and things that didn't get rag tops. And then you had like the show custom scene, and then you had the real custom scene where you had like people that were chopping tops, shaving door handles, doing a lot of that stuff. And then you had cars that were kind of a blend of both. So the scene was really about taking your car that's just a regular Beetle and then individualizing it and making it personal to you. Now, as the scene starts to evolve from there, probably around the mid to late 80s, early 90s, I think, is when you start to see the switch. Because as I'm kind of going through the magazines looking at this, you see cars that start to lean back to like a little bit of homage to the cow look, a little bit like a more of a modern cow look, right? And then that modern cow look, which was like kind of a smooth, clean car, monochromatic, polished Fuchs, bumpers or no bumpers, but kind of just keeping it, more a little less outrageous with crazy wild paint jobs, and more, there was a tendency to start going more back towards the Resto Custom thing. So about the early 90s, you really start to see the Resto Custom aspects start to come in. 5 spokes are really popular. You start to see predominantly a lot more 5 spokes out at the car shows. You're still seeing some Raspberry paints. You're still seeing some graphics, still seeing a bunch of those custom touches, but you start to see everything start going towards a Resto Custom vibe. Now there's probably a dozen or so cars during that time in the early 90s that were still coming out with graphics. And they were still coming out with graphics and wink mirrors and, custom modified taillights and little bits and pieces like that. And then, July of 1992, you've got VW Trends where you've got Gary Berg's blue car in there, the Burglar. That car is more of a traditional. It's kind of a traditional cow look car. It's got the BRMs. It's a drag car. People see that car and it starts to push and influence the scene. Obviously, it starts with more than that. Like people get in the hobby, and I think speaking with some of the guys in the magazines, around the mid 80s is really the height of the VW magazine scene. It's just it's the boom before it starts to taper off a little bit. And you see in the late 70s, like the bug-in stops. And I'm sure one of these days I'll sit down with the guy and get some detailed information as to why and what were the details behind the bug-in stopping. And it would be an interesting thing to understand. But then you start to see like Al Martinez come out with the Jamboree. And that's the first event I went to. And those events were just like so cool and I think a lot of it has to do with demographic as well, right? We're all in our late teens, early 20s. We're getting in these Volkswagens, and you're not in high school anymore. You're a little bit older. You might be making a few more dollars, and you start to do a couple more cool things to your car. And then you start to see some other fads that come into play. You start to see, when you really see the Resto Custom part take off, I'm looking at February 1996 VW Trends. There's a yellow and white two-tone Beetle on the cover. Earlier in 1995, there's the black and white two-tone Bug that is called the 21st Century Look Today, is what it says. And that car is a perfect example of, it's a black and white, two-tone with the white door inserts, black and white with a white roof rack and fully polished Porsche alloys on it. Now, that's the Resto Custom look around the mid 90s. It really starts to come in, kind of keeping it stock-ish with some accessories, right? And from that point, we start to see how the accessories that in the 80s nobody wanted, they start becoming really popular with the aftermarket people. So the aftermarket people are starting to they're getting into a lot of the roof racks, luggage racks for the back hatch. I remember the vent window deflectors, wind deflectors were popular. And so right around mid 90s, you start to see the custom hobby start pursuing a lot of the rare vintage accessories, coolers, the swamp coolers for the side of the car and things to that extent. And so you start to see the hobbies now evolving from customizing the car to being like yours individually the way that you want it, to now it becomes a little bit of a look back, a little bit of retro. And I think it's because the Volkswagen had been around so long at that time that people started to respect the early cars. In the 70s and 80s, there was a few guys that were really sticklers on early cars and they had to be this year or earlier. But the majority of the VW hobby was like, a bug's a bug and we don't care. Well, about the early 90s to mid 90s, you really start to see the majority of people start looking for earlier cars, because now everybody's looking back to the new look, like we want to do something a little bit retro. I'm looking at these old vintage cars. They're kind of cool. And you start to see a little bit of that evolution of the vintage OEM starts to meet the aftermarket, like the custom car hobby. So now 5 spokes, I'd have to say the popular wheel of the 90s, and you can debate me on this, but I think you'll probably lose. The popular wheel of the 90s was the 5-spoke, the fully polished 5-spoke, because 4-wheel disc brakes weren't big by then. If you had 4 disc brakes, you had some good money, or you had converted to 4-lug and you drilled to Porsche pattern or bug pattern, things like that. But for the most part, the average enthusiast was running polished 5 spokes, because that set of wheels and tires changed the whole look of your car, and you don't have to go deep and change the brake system and all that stuff. So I think that's one of the reasons why the 5-spoke was such a hugely popular wheel. And narrowed beams really hadn't come into play. Now, they had been done a lot before then. And what I mean by a lot, like more than a couple dozen narrow beams, as I'm starting to really research this, are out there, but not a lot. It hadn't become commonplace. And so as in 1996, I'd finished my first car, which was my 63 Bug that you guys have seen me look out for in the, I put a couple ads on Instagram trying to track down the original car. And that car was polar silver, black rag top, all the chrome on the body, the billet running boards that were black with the polished ribs, and tweed interior, because in the 90s, tweed was really a popular look. And we were now coming out of the two-tone vintage look and moving into kind of the back to a little bit of monochromatic old school. Now, my cars, I've always just been a big proponent of doing what I wanted to do with my cars. And so like trying to just really be different. I did phone dials because everybody had Fuchs, and the car was polar silver on 15 and 16 inch phone dials. And I picked phone dials because of the offset, because I wanted to do drop spindles so I get the best ride. So you start to see drop spindles become popular. Well, drop spindles push your wheels out. Then people start searching for different wheel offsets. There's a car on the cover of December of 1998, and he's got Cup 1 chrome wheels on his, and those have a full positive offset where the center of the wheel is pushed all the way out and the wheel can be tucked in, because with adding that track width to the front end, you're now going to rub the fender if you want the car to sit low. And so after the, like by the early 90s, you stop seeing scallops on cars. The last one that I see is like 1995. After that, I don't see any more scallops on the cover of cars for the rest of the 90s on the cover of Hot VWs, now with VW Trends. Last time you see scallops on the cover of VW Trends is you're going to be pushing early 90s if you're even seeing scallops. And I'm basing it on the cover based on the magazines were always trying to put out the latest, greatest, and the newest stuff. And so scallops by that time had been kind of dated. Those are from the 80s, but they were still putting them out in the 90s. It was still kind of that hot rod vibe, but really right around mid to late 90s, you start to see the Resto Custom thing come in. The black oval that I used to own belonged to my friend Sean. That was in October of 99 issue, and it's titled Desert Cruiser VW Trends, and it is an accessorized classic. So my buddy Sean was making great money. He was younger. He had a 56 oval, and he bought almost every accessory you could do. When I got the car from it had the skirts, it had the trailer, it had the roof rack, had the sun visor, had the Impy bumper bars, it had the fender flag, it had so many different things, the back window blinds, it had the bud vase, it had the swamp cooler. I mean, he had everything. And at the same time that is happening, you also start to see, again, because now Volkswagen's been around long enough, we're looking back at the past, the hobby, and appreciating some of the older things. You also start to see the Impy craze start to kick off again. And that Impy craze is collecting all Impy GTV parts. Now, I know there's a bunch of guys that say, oh, I was collecting Impy parts in the 70s and 80s, and that's great. The reality is it got really, and what I'm really talking about is when the hobby shifts to like the majority of the people. Like if you're just a handful of people are collecting the Impy steering wheels, you're not going to reproduce them and make them. Around the late 90s, they start reproducing a bunch of Impy parts because everybody's searching for old Impy parts and pieces to start accessorizing their cars. So then I would almost deem the mid to late 90s like the accessory explosion. Everybody was trying to accessorize their car. You'd go to car shows and you would see just about every car that's out there would have every type of vintage accessory that you could see. And that pushes all the way into the early 2000s. You'll start to see that where cars are really heavily accessorized. And you now start to see the hobby really focused, hyper-focused on early cars. Everybody's looking for early cars. When I was in the hobby in the 80s, ovals seemed so rare, like really ridiculously rare. Well, as the hobby continued to evolve, you started to see more and more people go get an oval out of the wrecking yard, build it, get it on the road, because ovals were now becoming hugely popular. I do remember one specific cover of Hot VW's magazine, and it was, I saw it at the Jamboree one year, and I'm looking here real quick for it, but it was a raspberry colored oval window, and it was super clean, fully chromed 5 spokes, and I remember seeing it at the Jamboree, and that car was so clean, and it was just simple, stockish, some accessories, but it had the chrome, it had the chrome 5 spokes on it, and it started to have, it wasn't over accessorized, and this car was kind of merging the hobbies. Yeah, it was September 1993, and it's titled Awesome Oval, and it's a raspberry colored oval, 2-fold oval ragtop, blonde girl on the cover, and yep, you won't forget the blonde girl, and fully chromed 5 spokes on it. That car is the car that is kind of the Resto Custom thing in my head when I think Resto Custom mod. That car was just, the paint was super clean. And so now that people are doing less custom stuff and more stock, they really started to pay attention to the cleanliness of the workmanship that had been done. And this is when you start to see a lot of the really, really wild high-end paint jobs. Matter of fact, there's going to be a car at One Crazy Weekend that you guys will get a chance to win in a raffle. It was on the cover of Hot VW's, the January 1995 issue. And you'll see the car at One Crazy Weekend. It'll be on display there. It was built by Del Ford. It's a car that was built in Las Vegas. It's a 1965 oval window ragtop. So Del Ford was a paint and body guy that customized this bug, and it had candy apple red front, scallops that went to the back. And he was a little bit older than us. And this car belonged, my friend Ronnie ended up with it. His dad ended up with the car. Ronnie's dad just recently passed away. So Ronnie thought, hey, I'm going to do a GoFundMe. I'll have the car over at One Crazy Weekend, and people that donate to the GoFundMe, will raffle the car off to the people that have entered into the GoFundMe, just try to raise some money for his mom. And so I thought it was super cool to be able to do that. So we'll be doing a podcast on that coming up here. But that car it was kind of a tail end car in the 90s because it was 1995, but it's got candy apple red scallops with shadows and 16-inch Fuchs on it in the magazine. And the car is a little bit different today, obviously, because of a few years, but for the most part, it's mostly the same. But that car, 1995, one of the last ones I see in Hot VWs with scallops, that's on the cover. And now, as we enter into the early 2000s, you start to see a little bit of the change. And you really start to see people, really a majority of the hobby, start to focus on some of the cow look, some of the vintage. Because then now, as everybody's looking back, you've got a couple different guys. You've got the guys that just love the stock 36 horses, slam cars, skirts, for lack of a better expression, kind of a German folks look, you know, kind of a all OG, laid out, chromed 5-spokes. There's a lot of people that are into that, like vintage style resto custom. And then you start to see a lot of people starting to really connect with the cow lookers of the 70s, and they're starting to update those. The new BRMs come out. The new BRMs have been out for a while. They came out in 1992, but you start to see those on the cars, and that really starts to kick off some of the cow look resurgence, right? A lot of guys getting back into it because there's way more guys into the cow look today than I think were into it back then. And you start to see a lot of this evolution of this. The hobby really seems to, from my opinion, to go back into looking at where we were, and whether it's you're building cars that are stock, lowered, but not really updating them, because now we've made a full shift, right? It's more about vintage, original parts pieces, what it was like back then. A lot of the early stuff gets real popular. Ovals are all over the place. Now splits are starting to show up like crazy. So the hobby as a whole starts looking backwards and really starts to try to chase pieces and parts of history. And when I'm speaking about this, I'm speaking mostly of the car show scene, the average hobby, not drag racers, not any of these off-road guys, not any of these specifics, but the majority of the hobby, which is usually the street scene, is kind of the majority of the hobby. But you really see people starting to, you know, go back to the way things were and really appreciating that. And as you're starting to see more cars, then comes this push where it's like, who's got the earliest? Who's got the coolest? Who's got an early oval cow looker, an early oval vintage resto custom, then split windows, and you know, it just continues to keep going back a little further. Now you're still seeing some custom cars come out, but custom cars are coming out probably at about vintage to custom. I want to say, when I say vintage, I'm going to say retro as a general blanket between cow looker, like cow look throwbacks, paying homage to the 70s style, to the vintage retro look, you know, where it's all vintage accessories, all stock, all OG, laid out, slammed. As you start, so that you have, that's the majority of the hobby that you start to see. And there's 10 of those to every one custom, because you're seeing cars in 2000s with, you know, tribal flames and billet wheels, and, you know, doing some of these special, you know, like the big 5-spokes and 16-inch wheels. You start to see some cars like 2003. You start to see there's a Florida Street Screamer, it says on the cover, March 2003, and that car's got 17-inch wheels on it. And they're like a Boyd style cast wheel, polished aluminum, but kind of a little bit of a hot rod look. But you're really seeing the custom car built for the individual, let's say. You really start to see that car in and of itself. There's like one of those to every 10 retro style cars. And then the retro style game, I don't want to say it hits a plateau, but it kind of gets to the point where, okay, everybody's retro, and then now you get two cars that came on the scene at that time that really had a huge impact, were Ryan Reed and Aaron Broughton. Now, both of those guys being VW guys and being in the hobby at the time, but also being influenced by super clean, less is more hot rod style. And Aaron and Ryan, their two cars came out and they kind of had an impact on the scene because they were super clean, not over accessorized, laid out, detailed Fuchs. They were more slammed than a cow look. So I can't really call them cow look. They had big motors, but these cars were really, really, really detailed. And that's because both those guys still to this day do custom cars, build custom cars, and they cut their teeth in the hot rod world. And that started pushing the envelope a little bit, where you started to see people start paying attention to, like, okay, now I've got these cars. How can I make my 57 diamond green oval different than everybody else's? And I don't want to tchotchke the thing up with 1,000 accessories. And that's when you start to see a lot of people put a lot of attention to detail into those cars and really start to push the boundaries of detail, like doing a lot of detail. I mean, even when you're going back to talk about custom cars again, one of the first times that we see a car built by Buddy Hale's car is in it's on the November 2000. He's built in a car. There's the whole Duran Kafer thing, right? Which was like, that had an influence in the hobby of like pushing clean cars that were fast cars, and they had to be clean. That was kicked off, if I'm not mistaken, by Frenchie DeHoo, and the premise behind that was like, we want clean cars and fast cars. So you've got to have a combination between super clean and detailed and very fast. And that also pushed some of the hobby. You have, the first time that there's the killer Carmen that's on the cover of September 2001, the convertible Carmen Ghia that's got the torque thrust wheels on it. There's a lot of cars that you start to see that are, the hobby's kind of going two ways. It's going kind of hot rodish with some of the people that are wanting to do updated wheels, updated brakes, that type of stuff. And then you see the other side where a lot of the guys are doing that whole retro thing. And then because of everybody's push for like super clean, super detailed, you now start to see the hobby take off into a whole nother direction, and there's still, don't get me wrong, there's still custom cars out there. There's still custom chop top cars, and there's still cars that are, custom made. You've got the Utah Slam Station was a car that was built by Dave Kindig in November of 2004. And it's a wild full custom. It's a heavily hot rod influenced, orange sickle car. And then not but 2 months later, you have another, impy bug, or a oval window that's smoothed out and has a real heavy hot rod style on it. And that one is in the January 2005 issue. So as you see the mid 2000s start to hit, you see that. But the very next issue, another game-changing car. It's Randy Gates. February 2005, he's on the cover of Hot VWs, and it's Randy Gates split window. That's the car that got me. When I saw that car, I just kind of stopped in my tracks, because when I saw that car and the level of detail that went in that car, it really fired me up to build my first Type 34 Ghia, which was the gray car that was on the cover in 2009. So a couple of years later, it was on the cover of Hot VWs. But in February of 2005, you start to see the real detailed stuff really kick off when Buddy debuts Randy's car. That's a real showstopper, really pushes the scene a lot. And if you're looking and I'm just going based off the cover of Hot VWs, right? Like, that's the last car up until December 2005 that you see that's kind of a Cal-Look throwback, ultra clean. So it's like, this is like a Duran Kafer car on steroids because of the level of detail and simplicity, and because you see the hobby start to focus on less is more. Everything's kind of going back to like simple, streamlined, minimalist. And then you have the other side of the hobby where it's like the next page, you see a car that's got the torque thrust, fully polished torque thrust. And 2 issues later, you see a California Speedster kit car with billet wheels on it. So the hobby's really going on 2 different sides, but the majority of stuff that you're seeing at the shows are going to be a retro flavored car. There's still your and the buses are starting to get popular now by early 2000s. I know bus guys are like, no, buses were popular before then. No, they weren't. I mean, they were, but they were popular only amongst bus guys. Now some of the custom car guys started getting into buses, started, building some buses, some custom stuff. I mean, my bus was in 2003, November 2003, Hot VWs, and it was, 17-inch wheels, big Type 4. You could start to see buses that were looking different than your typical bus. They weren't, some of your stalkers and things to that extent. So really started to kind of go that direction. And then as we continue on, I think December 2005 has it's called Graphically Ghia, and this car has got, the guy wanted everything. He wanted stripes, he wanted fades, he wanted tribal, he wanted checkers. He has every type of custom paint on this orange Ghia convertible. And the cover, it's December 2005. It says Graphically Ghia. And the guy basically checked every box when it said, what do you want in your custom car? It's like me at Five Guys, right? They give you the list of all the options, and I just load it up till I ruin it. So not saying he ruined his car, but listen, he's got everything. And so it's really heavy. The scene is really, there's almost 3 scenes here at this time, because you start to see the retro scene, which it's like, as soon as you turn to 2006, the first 2 issues that come out for, by this time, VW Trends is done. They're done in 2005. They shut down shop, and their last couple years, you're seeing Trends was trying to do some different stuff. There's a little blip on the screen with Volksrods. I know the Volksrod guys will be like, no, it's not a blip on the screen. It doesn't get a ton of coverage in the magazine. The magazine's still focused on shiny cars. But you do see a couple of issues of Trends in the last year or so that they're out where, they've got one with an impy inch pincher bug on the cover, and they're paying a little bit of attention to the past. And then they have their last issue, which is March of 2005. Now, getting back to Hot VWs, which is still around at the time, you see a lot of the cars are starting to change from the standpoint of the first 2 issues that you see for 2006, you've got Richard Rivera's, the German folks, the famous Rich is 50, Texas Brown, painted by Buddy Hale, a lot of detail work. Again, another super detailed, high-end, let's start, less is more. How do we detail less? Let's start chroming. Let's start anodizing. Let's start doing these little bits and pieces. And the next issue, right, is Patrick Friel's Cowlook car. He still has it to this day. It's like a metallic blue oval window bug, and it's a Duran Kafer car. And then you see on the next issue a bug with full custom wheels. So there's those 2 factions where you've got guys that are going way out of control with like the custom wheels, the billet stuff, because then you get right over to May and you've got a bus 21 window with tribal flames and billet wheels and flames down the sides. You know what I mean? So you're seeing 2 kind of factions. But again, the real custom stuff, there's 10 to 20 of the lowered original, Fuchs, 5-spokes. There's 10 of those cars to every one of these full customs. And as things have evolved from then things became, get more clean, get more detailed, more buses are coming out, you start to see a lot of the detailed double cabs. Mark, one of my buddies from DBK up there in Central California, his red double cab, you just start to see a lot of really clean and simple. Everything's going for clean and simple. And every now and again, you're still seeing a little tribal here, a little custom chopped and scalloped, but that's so minute and off to the side. And those guys are super committed to the show scene, and those guys are really keeping maybe the vision of the early aspect of the hobby when these cars were an individual detail for each person to kind of express themselves through it. And I think, as that's gone on, and we're only into 2008, I mean, we're still years away from where we're at, but as we see the hobby evolving and evolving, it keeps going more retro, more retro, cowl look, more keeping it stock, detailing it, doing more detail, not so many accessories, and cleaning it up, a lot more than just the, just your average paint job. Now you're looking at wiring, you're paying attention to the paint on the backside of dashboards. I mean, there's so much stuff that's out there that it's really so much focus spent on detail work on these cars that the hobby as a whole changes. And I think what's happened with the hobby that we've seen a bunch of is really people just expressing their own individuality, and they're doing it, but they're doing it with some pretty heavy guardrails, right? They've got to stay true to original colors. They're staying true. I mean, you get every now and again, you get these wild cards, you get these wild turbo cars, or you get like Joe Cormier's 1968 fuel injected, turboed, Fiske wheels, super clean, like ultra nice bug. One of my favorite cars that I saw at the Grand Ashford Roadster Show came down, and I'm not sure. I don't think it got an award at the DKP event, and in my opinion, it was the cleanest car there. It was definitely my speed because I really love the look of it. And as again, there's one of those cars to every 20 Cowlooker original Fuchs, and we've almost been Fuchs to death at this point now. And then now they made Fuchs in a 17-inch and a lot of that stuff. And you kind of see, and I don't want to say the hobby's in a rut, but there's definitely, and it might be the taste of the people that are around right now. What may be really pushing this is that Volkswagens have become fairly expensive. If you want to find them, I mean, you can still find them out there cheap, but if you're trying to find really early cars, they're not super inexpensive, and people maybe justify the purchase by looking at them as an investment. And with that, that's also having an impact on the customization that people do. Now you still see people customizing some stuff, and there's their fair share of that, but there's so much more of the stock, keep it stock, don't modify it where it can't be put back to original. And those cars get a lot of coverage. I mean, those cars you're seeing on all the magazines. You get a couple breakthroughs. 2008, you have my buddy Lester's car. That's the Desert Dreamer, and it's the red. It's a red 67, red 67 or 66. Got 66 style headlights on it, but it might be 67. But you see that car, and it's got billet wheels, all full air-cooled suspension. You start to see some of the air stuff get in there, and there's a contingency in the hobby that really starts to go air. Now, in Europe, they're doing way more air than we are at this time. They're doing way more. They're really getting hooked into kind of I want to say it's more the patina look that really starts to take off. It's way more in the UK than here, but you definitely start to see it here. And there's a ton of cars, and you start to see it really changing the scene in the UK and in Europe, but here, not as much, especially from a magazine standpoint. In the magazines, you're still seeing shiny cars. You're still seeing a lot of traditional cow lookers. You're still seeing a lot of these cars that are factory colors, original, mostly everything, fenders, and not a lot of stuff customized. And lately in the hobby, what you've seen just a majority of is mostly original cars and not really a ton of customization. And so bringing all that together, you know, and next week I may have one of my buddies on to debate me in this, because we started having a conversation about this and had some pushback on it. But you start to think that everyone's so focused on keeping these cars the same. It's like, where's the big systems in the cars anymore? You know, you'd look in the 80s and the 90s, and you'd see guys, every car had a stereo system, every car had amplifiers, every car had subwoofers, every car had all this stuff. And now when you see these really super clean cars, they're missing all these things. They're missing all these little cues to dial these cars in to make them personal, certain things. And what I'm thinking of is, you don't got to get wild to have your car stand out. You just have to do something different. And there's a different when you go too far, and there's a different when your car is a standout. Now, the goal of being individual with your car is that you like it first and foremost, and that it's what you wanted to build. And I think a lot of people nowadays they've got, obviously the population of the VW enthusiasts has aged. So we're all now in our 30s, 40s, and 50s, some guys in their 60s and 70s. The hobby's a broad range, but for the most part, a lot of the active people in it are in their 40s and 50s, and probably mostly in their 50s. Now, these guys have more discretionary income to spend, and so they have the wherewithal to start building really nice cars. When you start to see a lot of these really nice cars built, which started happening in the late 2000, like 2005, 6, 7, you start to see those years come out. You really start to see a lot of high-end cars come out. But all these cars are coming out. There's no stereo systems. They're, really focused on clean, simple, not too much. But driving it around, it may or may not be fun. Driving it around, you get a 2300 in the back that's got a little bit of a temper, and it maybe is not, it's not what used to cruise. And in the early days of the hobby, we'd get in our car and we'd just cruise at a 1600. You put K&N air filter on it and a Stinger, and all of a sudden it felt fast, but it really wasn't that much faster. Sure did make a lot of noise, and everybody could hear you coming, but it was enough to put that in and be able to have your stereo system and turn up your music and not have to worry about the motor running hot or things, or what's that rattling or that ticking or that this or that. And I think a lot of that stuff you've seen kind of go by the wayside. And so with Zorba, the Ghia that I've built, I went to a place with this car where I had a lot of individual input on this car with respect to some of the detail stuff that I wanted. And I wanted the car to pay homage to my dad, my heritage, and the reason the car in 2001, September 11th, 2001, I was looking at my Instagram on my Bill T Vegas, and I sent out an Instagram post, and it said, it had my Ghia sitting underneath, and my garage had a Greek flag hanging on the ceiling, and the car is sea blue and white, and the Greek flag is sea blue and white. And I said, this car is going to be known as Zorba the Ghia, and it'll be a tribute to my heritage of being Greek. And so that was the genesis of starting this car. And a lot of this conversation was, as I've been looking at the scene, and it's been a long time since I've had a car come out that I built. The last car that I built was my double cab in 2010. I've had some miscellaneous cars here and there. Mostly just kind of picked up a couple retro cars that I've enjoyed owning. And the last car that was featured was the carbon cab, which again it's a different car. It's not a stock. It's not a retro. And they've always been super fun to me. They've always been something that's been an expression of me and what I wanted. And there was something that inspired me that I said, I'm going to take this thing and build that. With the carbon cab, if you Google search the Cayenne by Tech Art, they have a meteor gray one on platinum wheels with big red brakes. And that, when I saw that photograph, I said, that's the style I'm doing my double cab. And then the rest is kind of how it came together. Now, with this car, because it's a Type 34 Ghia that's being built, I wouldn't want to do any body mods to it, but the car is a really unique looking car. And I haven't seen the car since it's finished, and I've gotten a bunch of feedback from a lot of people that have seen the car. some of the magazine editors in the UK, some of my friends, car builders from all over the world that are friends with Andy that he sent pictures to. And then I said, what do you think of the car? And I'm getting a lot of feedback on it that it's really different than what's out there today. We're going to find that if that's a different good or a different what. And there's probably one of the biggest things I haven't seen is the detail on the car. And that's going to make the car also stand out quite a bit. I'm excited to see it. And I trust what Andy's done for it. But more importantly, there were some decisions made in this car with building this car that took me back to the earlier days when we were building our custom street cars, even when we were broke. I was more focused on subwoofers than cylinder heads because I didn't have the money for a big motor. And every time I touched my car, it had to be back together by the weekend so that I could drive it back and forth to work or wherever I was going to take the car. And it was more about, because of the original genesis of me starting in the hobby, wanting a custom car, trying to personalize it and make it mine. And whether I fell into the two-tone fad for a while or the Resto custom look for a while, those have an influence. Even my Type 34 Ghia that was cover of 2009 Hot VWs, even that car had it kind of fell into a little bit of cow look. Was definitely different because it had the Type 4 motor and it had the Cosmic wheels on it, which not a lot of people were running at the time. And I wanted it to be different, but the paint colors and some of the detail and Buddy Hell doing a lot of his specialty stuff on that. I definitely stole the shift light and line lock tree from Randy Gates of Heaven car. A lot of that stuff, when you see other people doing things on their car, it kind of gives you some influence. And so with the new car that's coming out with the Ghia and with the technology that we have today, we did custom wheels on my Ghia. Custom wheels are within reach for a lot of people nowadays. Back in the earlier custom days, you'd find wheels from another car, you'd get wheel adapters, make them fit, but the custom wheel game wasn't as capable as it is today. And so with the capabilities that we have now between 3D printing, 5-axis CNC machining, all these things, you're seeing tons of this really creative stuff in some of the full high-end custom cars. Turmoil, to say the least, right? Like, that's probably the benchmark of custom Volkswagens that's been built to this day. And Turmoil has got a lot of really, really custom parts and pieces on that car that really just genuinely set it apart from everything else on the road. And the technology is out there. It's out there today for people to do really unique one-off things for their cars. And I don't know if the hobby's just been if everybody's just too focused on the investment of the car or trying to keep it where it can always be put back to stock. But there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of these cars. And I'm hoping when my car comes out and it's seen by a large majority of people, I'm hoping that it inspires other people to get creative with their builds and do something a little more out of the box. The color I picked, because there's so many cars today when I go to a car show, stock colors, stock steering wheels, stock everything, slightly modified, but everything is still within the realm of stock. So ultimately, I want to see people making VWs unique in their own and not feel like they have to build them within the guardrails of what they got to do. Because I think the hobby was at its most fun when you'd show up to the show at a Jamboree and you'd see the first time I remember the bus with all the Earthquake subwoofers in it, and it was like a raspberry and white bus or pink and white bus, and it was lowered on 5 spokes, and it was cool because you hadn't seen one of those yet. And so people were starting to just get creative with whatever they had, expressing themselves out of it. And some people I'm sure you guys can look at that barn door that's been all custom modded with the Briz bumpers and all that stuff, and you guys might not like it, but you remember it. And that's the cool part about the hobby, is in these past 20 years of the hobby, there's a handful of cars that in a circle of VW people go, who remembers this car? And the majority of hands will go up. And maybe one episode I'll do an elimination of, let's say, maybe we'll do it for every 10 years, we'll do an elimination of, some of the top featured cars that were featured. I mean, that's the other tough thing, right? There's a lot of really cool cars that may not have been featured, but they're really unique, or they didn't, during in the 80s and that time, they didn't play politics with the magazines, or who knows. There's lots of stuff, but we'll limit it to the magazines as far as who wants to, we'll go through like an elimination ladder. So I'll do that one of the episodes upcoming, but I'm excited to debut this car. It's currently on the boat right now. It's headed over here. It's supposed to be landing in Texas somewhere around the 10th of September. With that being said, we'll be jammed. It's going to be tight driving down to Texas, picking that car up. If everything works out, if that car shows up on the 10th, it'll be ready to pull out of customs by the 13th, or out of the shippers by the 13th, which there's a possibility we could end up at Texas versus the World, but the car won't be on display there because the car will be on display at One Crazy Weekend. So it'll be tucked away in a trailer, but it may make a double, an extra day over there in Texas if it times right. But that all depends on when the ship's getting in. I just asked a buddy of mine who's down there, I said, "Are we out of hurricane season yet?" He said, "No, it still goes till October." So we'll see. Fingers crossed, all good. I'll be doing a podcast coming up soon with Andy Finch. We're going to talk about the whole build process and the story behind the build, because it's definitely a unique story. It took a lot of twists and turns, and what you saw on Instagram and Facebook are some minor things compared to the overall experience of building this car. And it's been great. It's been fun. I'm super excited to get the car. It's 5 months since that car was dropped off to the day that it was dropped off till it was shipped back here. 5 months. So I can't thank Andy and his crew enough for them really kicking it in high gear and just putting all their energy and effort into this. And it started out as like, this is just going to be a scuff and shoot job. And it clearly blew up into way more than that. But I definitely would like to see more people being a little more individual, a little more custom with their car, especially with some of these rare cars. That'd be super cool. People have some unique stuff and they do it their way. So ultimately, that's where I see the hobby's been for a while. And for me, I always want to make sure that my car is different and my car stands out, and it's not the red one on Fuchs, and no disrespect for red cars on Fuchs, but you see a lot of them, and it's just one of those things where I've been pushing to try to do something different to make sure that the cars that I drive are memorable and people remember them because they kind of stand on their own. So hopefully that's been done. If you guys got any feedback, comments, or complaints about this, feel free to DM me, Facebook message me, or you can send me an email at bill@letstalkdubs. And I think that wraps it up for today. I've kind of gone over my opinion on that. If you guys think I'm right, wrong, or indifferent, let me know what you think about the scene. I'll do a little post on Instagram so you guys can see it, and we'll take a poll on there. But I think that's it, guys. And until next week, later.
You probably don't know that there's a new Volkswagen out that doesn't look like a Volkswagen.